So theme today, new coordination and market dynamics. And what does digital transformation mean for crucial issues, economic growth, inclusion, innovation, competition, lots of good stuff. So backdrop, not a novel slide, but I often will hide all the green and talk about the old economy as kind of the biggest 7 firms being in energy and finance. But of course, we all know what's happened with the growth on the tech side. And not all of that revenue and market cap on those green bubbles can be attributed to platforms. But I think that if we were to dig into the revenue and business models of those firms, we'd see a lot of it. Huge market cap, scaling fast, largely grew up in B2C, but the B2B side is growing really fast. And that's what I want to talk about today and where I'm starting to try to do a lot more work. And I'm not going to talk about monopoly and antitrust, but I think probably half the people or more on the call today are getting rapidly sucked into that world. Just to recap, traditional linear value chains, we'll call them pipes, accumulate value from stage to stage. We're to dig into a lot of kind of management literature and economics. It would have this sort of diminishing returns to scale. Somebody needs to mute. Ant Xiaopin needs to mute. You don't see a lot of network effects in this type of a structure. But of course, and again, this is just a view, we have this more fluid structure in platforms that actually allow for swapping in and reconfiguring supply chains more rapidly. And that'll come to be important in my discussion. They often become multi-sided, and lots of people have categorized and tried to catalog this sort of life cycle growth over time. So COVID really seemed to accelerate the kind of tech/oil and banking divergence. Now, if you were to look at finance and energy, this data comes from about July. But the JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Saudi Aramco, Shell, Citigroup, Chevron, Airbus, they all took a tremendous hit. The energy has largely stayed flat. Finance has probably recovered about half of its losses, but still down. Flip side, on the platform and tech side, that was an explosion and that hasn't stopped. So we see kind of your Microsofts here on the call today, Apple, Tencent, Facebook, Alibaba, and so forth and so on. So something appears to be pretty different. We've talked about that in many conferences. And if we had sort of longer to dig into this switch between tangibles and intangibles, I think that would dovetail nicely with some of the slide decks that I think my follow-on speakers are going to get to. So what I want to pivot to is to talk about other firms. And what's happening in other sectors of the economy. So prior to COVID, I got wrapped up in this Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Production. And it was really a deep dive into, well, we could debate how deep, but a dive into kind of perspectives on business and operating models. What are these firms doing, and largely manufacturing firms, to change business models? And are we seeing some kind of industry transformation? Lots of different firms, some of whom are represented here today, but small firms, universities, and lots of big manufacturing firms. And so the first part of this study, hey John, thanks, was a little dry, but it was essentially to provide case studies and map sort of what are you doing in your sort of most novel business models, what's your roadmap on those? And then the World Economic Forum is really big into thinking about stakeholder capitalism and sustainability, inclusiveness. And I think, those dovetail to a lot of the concerns that we've got around rising inequity, around rising pollution, and around climate change. And so they're saying, well, are these business models doing anything that relates to those? So then COVID hits, and I did a number of probe interviews with a much smaller set of firms. And it was a really simple set of questions. I said, first of all, in the early days, what happened? What happened on the demand side? what happened on the supply side, and what did you do about it? And the responses, frankly, were quite emotional. So you really got to hear what firms and people went through as they tried to kind of deal with this. And you had sort of business as usual, and that wasn't too bad. A rapid pivot, if they were able to, a ride the wave or weather the storm. So some amusing titles, which basically mean either your demand stayed about flat and you didn't lose capacity, your demand disappeared, you had to reallocate capacity, you had an explosion of demand and you couldn't find enough supply, or you had to hunker down. So one example, which was pretty interesting, was out of the consumer packaged goods industry. So they just had a tidal wave of demand and you could just kind of hear it in their voices. And so they were scrambling to find any line anywhere on planet Earth that you could manufacture hand soaps and other cleaning supplies and any kind of personal protective equipment. And a lot of it turned out to be sort of allocation of supply in some sort of an equitable manner. And it ended up being super manual. So you'd think that we'd have all this kind of wonderful AI and machine learning and forecast planning tools, but they all blew up. So they had to turn it all off because everything was out of sample. They also discovered, and this gets into sort of the nature of a more triangular platform structure, that they needed to change a lot of policies and procedures to go into faster process validation, much faster supplier onboarding. And you could see them start to relax what would have been much longer term supply chain arrangements. And then just an explosion of e-commerce. And I think we've seen that the firms that did well, especially on the retail side, were ones that sort of had an omni-channel access to consumers, and the ones that were by and large only brick and mortar tended to suffer. And you could actually put as a special case kind of restaurants into that category until they reopened. And then they talked about stability returning. The models started to get retrained at this sort of new but much higher level. So that's kind of one story, and that's the explosive demand story. Then you kind of had the flip side. And this was out of the civilian aviation capital equipment market. And so these folks, basically, they're dealing with the barren desert right now. They have contracts that are power by the hour. So that means essentially they did what they had been told would be good to stabilize their revenue streams, which is to stop selling sort of lumpy capital equipment and then try to just monetize on service revenues, but instead bundle those together and just sell when an aircraft flies. And that works just fine until you ground the fleet. They had approximately a 90% revenue drop early on, and you can kind of see that in this graph of changes in weekly flight frequency. And the US is actually still way down. Global demand kind of back up to about half. You can see the China curve on the top, which seems to have come back primarily to normal, but they took some pretty dramatic actions. And this is Rolls-Royce. I'm just using it as an example, but it's across the industry. So 20% workforce reduction, a recapitalization. So they had to fix up their balance sheet. And they're looking at about a 4-year recovery. And so, you know, they're not looking at months, but they kind of have to weather this storm for quite some time. And then another example comes out of the automotive supply chain. And so in this case, it's a firm example way up the supply chain, widely used component, 100 million units per year. So basically supplying the entire industry. People are probably familiar with the bullwhip effect, which is when something small happens down at the end of a demand sort of instability, that amplifies back up the cycle. These guys were hitting about a 70% swing. However, they didn't panic. And the reason was that based on their 2009, 2010 experience, they said, well, we probably have about 2 to 3 months, and then we would expect this to go back. And it actually did. And the things that benefited their ability to adapt to that were primarily kind of around geographic and product flexibility, which means the assets could be used to address multiple markets in multiple regions. They viewed that as expensive. And if we have time in discussion, we should come back to that notion, because I think with increased digitalization and flexibility, there might actually be a revenue win there instead of just viewing it as an insurance contract. Agriculture capital equipment, that was an interesting one. This is primarily North America. Nothing terrible happened on the demand side, but the service side basically would have gone dark because people weren't allowed to be out in the field. And luckily, they had this digital investment in remote service prior to the pandemic, which was largely viewed as a waste. And I think that's an important theme because it gets to how these investments end up ultimately generating value and when and why. COVID hit literally right before the North American planting season. And the example here is meaningful because there's a 2 to 3 week window that you basically have to get the seeds into the ground or else you start to hit some yield losses. And so these people essentially were dealing with a lot of the productive capacity of North American farming. And then they said, well, luckily they had this remote monitoring investment and that made continued operations possible. Usage exploded. So kind of a good story, but almost by luck. I'm going to skip the additive manufacturing.
Jeff, I'm giving you a 3-minute time limit.
I have 3.5 on mine, Steve.
Okay.
You can read this slide later, but the food truck pivot was kind of fun because an intermediary came in to match supply and demand because the trucks themselves didn't have the sensing capability, and the stable demand pattern of lunch disappeared, but the evening dinner demand that was kind of day by day and region by region exploded, and they actually had more demand than they knew what to do with. Kind of interesting. Mayo Clinic has done an awful lot, and maybe Hal can talk to that because there's a big Google and petabytes of de-identified data, hundreds of partnerships. Probably the punchline there is that they had this roadmap of how to do partnerships that they figured would take around 10 years, and they largely think they've cracked how to do those in just the months. And that kind of notion of years of change in weeks and months was one that we heard a lot of. And so we were really interested in, well, what's the business and operating model adaptation? Lots of failures. I mean, we've got inflexible human resources and organizational processes. There were lots of kind of constrained capital issues, inflexible kind of information systems. And of course, the biggest one was this giant demand and supply imbalance that these people essentially had to rebalance in real time. But also lots of successes. And I think those dovetail to this kind of workshop today around redeploying manufacturing capacity, end-to-end digitalization, the effectiveness of remote access, and this technology that we're using today in many ways kind of mirrors that. Lots of cross-training was important, and the ability to use computers and kind of more digitization to complement the human capital was a story that we heard over and over again. Some systems, and I think Alibaba was one of them, stepped in to provide capital and liquidity to smooth things over. And then we heard this theme of kind of more fluid supply chain arrangements and platformization. So to wrap, and again, this is just a kind of exploratory work, interview data, some survey work to try to figure out, well, how are the non-tech firms taking these ideas, because they're all aware of what's happened, and trying to implement them. And then you have this very high stress thing with COVID that frankly gave them permission in ways that they might not have had to be able to do a lot of experimenting, because they had to. I mean, they had to adapt. The global context matters. We heard about trade tensions and resilience and climate change. The stress on the people, if you really talk to them, especially in the ones that had to do big adjustments, is just palpable. End-to-end digitization happened. I think the industry 4.0 of things in the factory and the supply chain are important because those are becoming a lot more visible up at the strategy side. So if you think about pivoting on new product development rapidly and having some visibility as to what the capacity is, it was much easier for those firms that had already made the investments. And then I'd say finally, the early efforts in digitization, AI, and machine learning often fail. And that's sort of a whole story, and I'm sure that the major tech vendors can speak to that, where firms think that they're going to get magic for their AI investment or digital investment, but what they really get is infrastructure. And if they're looking for sort of 2 to 3 year returns, they're not thinking about the problem right. So with that,